All right, folks, I'm Bryce Holdaway. I am the co-host of The Property Couch, and today with me I have Nerida, who's the Chief Economist at the REA Group, which is better known as realestate.com.au. Hello, Nerida. How are you?
I am well.
Now, I'm used to having you in the studio here, but I'm more than happy to take us over the internet here because I haven't caught up with you since the 25th of November, and there has been a lot happening. And of course, last month you were in the studio and you spent some time with Ben, which was great whilst I was away overseas. But I guess really chatting today, you'd think that the top of the discussion might be around interest rates, given the decision tomorrow. But I think it'd be fair to say that coronavirus is our number one. So we're going to cover that. But before we do, just to remind folks that to stick around to the end, because we're going to show you what Red Rooster has to do with property. So we're going to cover that towards the end, and we're also going to go through the most viewed, the most looked at listings for auction, for private sale, as well as the most expensive real estate in Australia in the last 7 days, and the most looked at rental. So we've got a lot to cover, Nerida, but I'm super keen to hear your views on coronavirus. Clearly, there's talk of it being a pandemic. There's reports just recently, in the last 24 hours, that the first Australian has passed away. So first of all, it's a humanitarian issue. And clearly someone's family has been affected by that, as well as many others across the country. But clearly, for the purpose of our discussion today, it's the impact that it has on the economy. What's the latest from your perspective at that 30,000-foot view of the economy with that virus?
Well, I guess there's the immediate impacts that we can see on economic growth, and then there's the forecast, which will depend a lot on how bad it gets. So this is a big unknown at the moment that on one hand, we know it is very clearly hitting the tourism industry and our education sector. As to where it goes from now, it depends how quickly they can sort it out. Because worst case, as you said, it's a health issue. So worst case, it does spread into Australia, and we see some pretty awful health outcomes. But from an economic perspective, it's obviously quite far-reaching. So maybe I'll start with what the immediate impact of it has been, because if you're in the tourism sector, you've not only been hit by bushfires, but you've also been impacted now by coronavirus. And the area that it's really impacting is tourism from China. A lot of the airlines have shut down flights. We've seen a big hit on our hotel industry. Anyone who's operating, I was just reading about places like Sovereign Hill who have really been hit from this downturn. And one of the main reasons is that we do rely very, very heavily on Chinese for a lot of things, and tourism is one. So 1.3 million Chinese tourists come to Australia every year. They account for 15% of total tourists. They spend around $1 billion a month. So already in the economy, we've lost $1 billion. They're also growing. So this is the other issue, that that was last year, but this year I think the tourism industry was expecting an even greater increase in the number of tourists from China. The other issue is around tourism. So education. So education is Victoria's number one export. It's the number two export coming out of New South Wales. To give you an example how dependent some universities are on Chinese students, the University of Sydney currently 25% of total students are actually foreign full-paying students from China. So huge impact there. They can't get out. They're having to do classes via internet. So there's some really big, and a lot of the universities now, they really have just shut down spending because they're just so unsure as to what will happen. From here, it will depend on economic growth as to what happens with economic growth. So the best estimates at this stage are best case. It's like what economists have been referring to as a very bad flu epidemic, which would knock 1% off global economic growth. Worst case, it forces the global economy into recession. So that's all that stock market volatility we saw last week was really on the back that people are very, very worried about what the impact will be on economic growth.
How do you reconcile that as an economist in terms of, because it's economics 101 about the multiplier effect. If you don't have these students hitting town, even really popular Chinese restaurants in Melbourne have had to shut down and let staff go, tourism, education, even supply chain, right? If they're shutting down factories in China, that means one factory can't supply the other factory that has that full-on multiplier effect. It's hard for the everyday Australian to really get a grasp of how it's going to land in terms of, but so I guess what would you say to even if you flow that through, it's got to have an impact. Surely it's certainly got to, we've got a robust economy, and we're probably, compared to the other developed economies around the country, we're probably doing okay, but that has to mean that our growth is impacted, and therefore we start to talk about the R word, right?
Yeah, look, absolutely, and I think the issue is, how quickly will it get sorted out? And if you have a look at, there's a counter, you can have a look on that counter online and see the impact of, see how many cases are getting announced, and it does seem to be flattening out. But I suppose, I'm obviously not a health professional, but I suppose these things can flatten out and then get worse again. So. Ideally, it will have an impact on economic growth, and there's really not much interest rates can do. I mean, you can't cut rates to zero and suddenly expect Chinese tourists to start coming back. There's not that immediate impact. So it will cut into growth, but at this stage, we don't exactly know how bad it will get, and ideally it gets resolved quickly, and it's a quarter of economic growth that we see poor rates of growth, and then we move back into a much better performing economy.
Do you a little bit of crystal balling, but do you think that because there's been the anxiety and the panic and the fear has been quite strong, and rightly so when you have something that's unknown, but even to the point where I can't quote the number exactly, but I think Corona beer has dropped 260 million in revenue just as a result of people sort of inadvertently linking Corona beer to this virus. But do you see that that increased anxiety and fear that may sort of perpetuate around lead to increased listings? Do you think that if we ground it back in Australian real estate, do you think that some people might sort of get caught up in that fear and think, well, I'd better liquidate, and that increases the amount of listings?
Yeah, look, the impact on property, it's a hard one. I mean, obviously, directly commercial property, we can see, as you said, retail property, really bad news. Which is already bad news. Hotels, if you're owning a hotel at the moment, you'd be pretty nervous. In terms of residential property, it's a little bit uncertain. I suppose on one hand, we go into recession and we lose jobs and we see rising unemployment, then that is very bad news for property, because we know that people are forced to sell and become highly distressed, and that's problematic. For listings, though, listings could go up. If you start to see people again, you head into a recession and people are forced to sell, then that can lead to increasing listings. Terrible for price growth. You don't want people panic selling or forced to sell, because that will lead to quite big drops in pricing. So I think that it is complicated. Like it's, you kind of have, right now, we know bad news for retail, bad news for hotels, bad news for anyone who's trying to rent a property close to a university. A global recession scenario is bad news all round. And, on one hand, bad news if we all catch it, but also hopefully we don't all catch it, but then bad news if we all start losing our jobs. And I think, that's how extreme it is at the moment, that it could be resolved in the next 2 weeks, or it could become a much bigger health issue.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the appeals of property, right? That it is an essential need. It's not as if you have that anxiety and you think, well, I'm going to sell my house and pitch a tent. It's just not going to happen. Whereas, so if there is an increase, as you flow that through, it might be someone's got their investment property or whatever. So, all right. So, is there a precedent for coronavirus prior? Is SARS or swine giving us any clues, or is this just so unique that that it's a genuine X factor that we don't know what's next?
Well, SARS does give us a clue. So that happened in 2004, and we were far less reliant on China back then. So, we didn't get anywhere near the number of tourists we get from China now, and our education sector wasn't so heavily reliant on China. But what happened with SARS, it was resolved. It led to 1 quarter of very slow economic growth in China. The next quarter, the Chinese government pumped in a whole lot of money into the economy through a massive infrastructure rebuilding project. And overall, year on year, economic growth was, as expected, and the SARS epidemic really had minimal impact on economic growth overall. But it could be, if that happened, which is kind of where I thought it was heading even, 2 weeks ago. I thought it was kind of heading to that. But I think the problem with this one, it's just dragging on and it's spreading. And I suppose it looks like it will probably be bigger than SARS. But ideally, if it does get resolved in, the next month or so, then, something similar happen, that people start to move in, different governments move to having big stimulus packages, big infrastructure building packages, and then eventually things kind of calm down and everything's full steam ahead again.
All right, so it sounds like we all just got to stay calm and see what happens next. So that leads me into interest rates. Before I ask you what you think would be the outcome of tomorrow, if you were offered a seat at the table tomorrow and you got your wish list to let them know what would you be advising if you're given your chance to give your feedback tomorrow?
I'd probably prefer to be talking at the table about the budget than the Reserve Bank. Look, I think the Reserve Bank they'll need to cut at some stage. It probably will be tomorrow. If not tomorrow, it'll be in April. So it's bound to happen at some stage. I guess the issue, we don't have much room to move with monetary policy. Will it be effective? We know that we've had 3 interest rate cuts already. It's led to a massive price boom in Sydney's premium suburbs, also Melbourne's premium suburbs. We're not really spending more. Retail is still very dismal. We're not building more yet. Building approvals have started to increase. We're certainly not selling more. So those 3 interest rate cuts, in the end, all they did was fuel a price boom in our most expensive suburbs, and there was really no other impact. Then it's probably, not advisable, but the impact of an interest rate cut does seem to be quite muted at this stage. Federal budget, though, I think that could really change things, and I think that could, if the government does start to push forward some pretty big infrastructure projects, or push forward push forward tax cuts, I think that might be more effective than just cutting interest rates again.
So you mentioned you prefer to be at the budget table rather than tomorrow. So what would you be saying? What would enthuse you about being part of that discussion?
The budget?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think the infrastructure projects that came up last budget, I thought were really good. The fast rail to Geelong, that would create not only a building program, but would really stimulate Geelong's economy. Really good news for people in Geelong. So not just local, but it would have statewide impacts, I think. Fast forward all those other fast rail. Fast rail, I think, is great for property, and I think it's great for regional areas. So fast rail to Wollongong, fast rail down to Gold Coast. I think all those projects, if you could fast forward them. I do think tax cuts, not just income tax cuts, but business tax cuts as well. They are in the pipeline, but maybe now's the time to pull them forward and get them up and running. So I think they're probably the main ones. I think infrastructure spending and tax cuts are probably the 2, and then obviously there's smaller programs that are put in place to stimulate things as well.
Do you think fast rail could get off the ground despite the many false starts in the past? Do you think there's any progress that would suggest that they could actually get them off the ground?
Yeah, the Geelong one's fairly progressed. They set aside $2 billion to get it up and running in last year's budget, and at the time, most people didn't think the coalition would actually win the election, so they did. So I guess the promise still holds, and it'll be interesting to see what comes up in this budget. Other things like city deals will be another one, which the the deals between state, federal and local government to get different cities up and running and far more economically viable. They're really positive things that can really help different areas around Australia.
So your call for tomorrow is a hold or a drop?
Yeah, I think at this stage it's looking like a drop.
Yeah.
I think that does seem the most likely. And if it doesn't drop in March, then tomorrow I think it'll be April.
You hinted on the fact that it doesn't have much of an impact given we're so... Well, no, you didn't say that. You said because the interest rates are so low, you question what impact it would have. So what do you... Is it a goodwill thing? Is it a token thing? Is it a sentiment thing? Is it a leadership seen to be doing something? Where do you think the major benefit of a drop comes tomorrow? Because like you say, it seems to just fuel the challenge of the big city property markets, and it's not hitting where it needs to go.
Yeah, that's what does seem to be happening. I suppose they do need to be seen to do something. I mean, you don't want to get to 6 months from now and be told that you pulled the rate cut too early. That's always a criticism, I guess, that they come up against. And also, I suppose as well, like, you've got to do something. So even if it's not very effective, at least it's something that has been done to try and get things up and running. I suppose what's worrying is that we don't have much room to move. We've only got 3 cuts left in us, and then we need to move on to quantitative easing, which sometimes is effective. Sometimes, it probably would be quite effective in this situation. I mean, if you have a look at when quantitative easing has worked, it has been in crisis type situations. If you have a look at Japan, which has now is technically now in recession, they've had quantitative easing for 20 years and it hasn't really done much. So, I think quantitative easing is a good thing if you are in a crisis economic situation and, perhaps, if coronavirus doesn't. Sorry, this is really negative today, but it's all this...
No, it's being real, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it is real. So if coronavirus does get us into this very dire economic situation, and, I do think quantitative easing would be effective, and we saw it being effective post-global financial crisis in the US. Once Brexit came in the UK, they implemented it as well. So it could be an option that we do need to look to. And this is the thing with economic growth, that, at the start of the year before coronavirus was really an issue, it did look increasingly unlikely that we would see interest rates being cut or certainly moving into quantitative easing, but now we have a crisis situation potentially, in which case things are looking very, very different and looking very different very quickly.
Yeah, I reckon you've got a tough job. I mean, even for me, who's just an absolute amateur economist, it's in terms of the fact that we're on the ground in the property market, we're seeing demand at the coalface, and particularly in the East Coast. We're not over in the West Coast at this stage, but you're seeing, listings are down, you're seeing demand up, the owner-occupiers are keen to buy, the interest rates are giving them, fueling all this confidence to take on more debt. And then on the other side, you've got to balance that with, well, everyone's a bit worried about the fact that we've got too much debt, and is the economy going to move into 2 quarters of negative growth? And you see last week that the stock market took a hit, and so it's very, very difficult to kind of project forward. But ultimately, I always say, whenever there's noise, go to the facts. And there's so many people moving to this country. We're still considered politically stable, financially stable. It's a great lifestyle. It's just there's just so much to navigate. But ultimately, if what we're saying to our clients and right now is that if you keep the fundamentals of asset selection at the cornerstone, which we always do, whether it's boom, busting or in between, generally speaking, they're going to be in demand in situations like this. But if there is ever a correction, you're still buying assets that are strongly in demand. And if someone was to fall off, it means that there's still 2 or 3 other people still interested in buying,
yes.
which helps underpin that. So you've got a tough job.
That's the thing. Yeah, I mean, property too. I mean, it's so local specific, and to say right now is terrible, awesome everywhere isn't true either. Or, conversely, if things go bad, it's going to be less bad in some locations than others. So it's, and I suppose, the other thing that makes it very hard for us is making a call about what's going to happen. And, people will get quite dogged in saying that, this is what's going to happen for sure. And the reality, look, no one can say, because we just don't know what will happen with certain things. We can try and predict what's going to happen, but things will often be better than what you predict, or sometimes they're far worse than what you predict. And that's what really makes it quite difficult. And what you say, what I say 2 weeks ago has changed, because coronavirus, I thought, would be resolved relatively quickly, and clearly it hasn't. So it's starting, it is becoming more concerning than it was.
Yeah. How do you, if we just pivot a little bit to, I hinted at it before, but the fact that there's often this concern about Australia's affordability, the amount of debt that we're getting into, and then you contrast that to, CoreLogic have an estimate that the market's worth $7 trillion at the moment with 1.8 in debt, so it makes it about a 26% LVR. So we're not vulnerable as an LVR overall, but I understand that some people have much higher LVRs, some people are fully paid off, and that's an average. But you then try and reconcile that with, okay, well then people start to say, well, we're really expensive compared to other countries, and you put out a chart, I think it was today or last week, around the fact that we are the highest if you take Hong Kong out, because that just blew the charts, cost per square metre. But then if you put us, the affordability costs about 16 years, I think you wrote 16 years to pay back when the average is 10, and in America it's 4. So how do you interpret all that?
Okay, so I guess the first one is that at a global level, Australia is very expensive, and every measure, if you look at the time taken to pay off a mortgage, if you have a look at price, if you look at income relative to price, it is a very, very expensive country. We are a wealthy country, though. So, I think then, it was interesting, the data was put out by the European Commission comparing every country, not every country, I think it was about 50 different countries around the world. On one hand, we're ranked second in price per square metre for property after Hong Kong. But on the other hand, in terms of affordability, they had us ranked about fifth. And it was because we have high income. So, so on one hand, we're expensive, but we also have high incomes. Then I suppose, the figure that the CoreLogic figure that you were quoting, on one hand, and then the other issue around how much debt people have, you have a big difference between older Australians and younger Australians. Yeah. So, someone in their 60s probably owns their own home, and they wouldn't have paid much for it relative to income back when they bought. Compare that to younger people who are having to take out far bigger mortgages. Any way you cut it, they're taking out much bigger mortgages than parents or their grandparents took out. So there is it's sort of this intergenerational issue around housing. And it's not just Australia. I mean, the Economist had a really good piece, a really good detailed piece they did on housing a few weeks ago, where they looked at around the world, and they even blame there's a big rise in far left politics in the US, and it's very popular amongst young people, and they blame the issue, housing, as a key issue, because younger people just can't afford housing, and older people own the majority of housing stock. So, they're complicated issues, and I think in Australia, we have done extremely well out of property, and people do, obviously they do lose money on property, but if you've bought in Melbourne and Sydney over the last decade, you'd be pretty happy, and life's good, and population's still growing, so there's no reason to suggest it's not good. Renting is still not a great way to be, and more people are renting. We've gone from a quarter of households renting to a third. I would never recommend to my children not to buy. I would tell them, get into the property market as soon as you can. It'll be the best financial decision you ever make. So, I think, there's that aspect that we have done well out of property. Our tax system favours owning property. At retirement, it puts you in a vastly different situation if you don't own a property, because, paying rent as someone on a fixed income would be really difficult. So there's a lot. The housing policy issue is very, very complicated, but I do think this affordability issue and this housing supply issue will become a bigger focus, and primarily because millennials who don't own a lot of property are reaching middle age. The oldest millennial is about to turn 40 this year, so they're getting older, they're getting more entrenched in business, they're getting politically louder, so potentially this will be a bigger issue. But Australia, it is expensive. Okay, there's no way around it. It's a very, very expensive country to buy in.
But all of what you said about the standard of living and the way the income we earn, is there anything that's concerning about that would continue to cause the American authors to come over here and talk about 40% Armageddons, or are you thinking we're just at an equilibrium that works in this market?
No, look, I can't see it. I just can't see a 40% reduction. I mean, even we did have a manufactured slowdown recently, but even that, it was manufactured. There was nothing. It was a restriction on finance that led to a switch in confidence. I mean, the only way we would see, a 40%, like, you've got to realise what a 40% reduction would take. I mean, it would have to be, 20%. I don't know, I've never modelled it, but it'd have to be a 20% unemployment rate or something.
Yeah.
Like, it would have to, so ridiculously terrible on every other level that, I think the value of our homes, we wouldn't even care about it because we'd be scrambling around trying to find jobs. So, so I think this is what you need to take into, everyone needs to take into account that to get a 40%, even a 20% drop, I mean, it's a massive hit on property markets, and it's so, it's hard for it to occur, particularly in our big capital cities. I mean, if you've been to, like, even Townsville, which is a very challenged market, I mean, I think that's dropped. I think over the past decade, it's probably worth around sort of 8-9% than it was a decade ago, and that's a really challenged market. So for Sydney and Melbourne to get there, it's got to be pretty dramatic.
I think the biggest comfort that people in this country can take is the fact that so many people want to come here. We're an empty island. We've got so much capacity to have more people. It seems like that's part of the Big Australia plan. So the fact that if you talk about the high unemployment, but it also has to be a massive drop in demand too, doesn't it? And if you've got all these people coming from other parts of the world that are a bit more expensive than us, or have more money, or they might come with a big cash deposit or whatever it takes to come over here, because we're pretty restrictive on who we let in. I think the Conisby calm is a very good thing there for us to take heed. Hey, we touched on a couple of things that I wanted to talk about around the property, other than the investor growth, the investor demand. The stats would suggest that the investors are not as active in the market as the owner occupiers. I think that would certainly be true, but I also think that actually, I shouldn't preempt it, but do you feel like the investor demand is a reflection more of people getting more savvy around what not to buy, rather than off the plan, medium density housing estates versus the type of stuff that we're buying, which is established properties? I can assure you there's still plenty of investors keen for that, because we're missing a few.
Yeah, no, they are. I mean, we track investor email inquiries. So if you go on realestate.com.au and you really like a house, you can contact an agent and you tick. I think you probably can choose to tick, but a lot of people will tick exactly what sort of buyer they are. And investor demand's picked up. Like we've seen from January, last figures I've looked at, I haven't looked at the February figures yet, but in January 20 compared to January 19, we have seen a significant pickup. So that's, that is good news. But as you said, they're looking at houses. Houses are the, pretty much everywhere at the moment. That's where we're seeing the big pickup in search. Off the plan, I think in Sydney, I think that's a market that is the locations that saw very high levels of off the plan development. They're the areas that are seeing dropping values still. Melbourne's holding up. I just had a look at some numbers this morning, and inner Melbourne units have actually gone up over the past 12 months. So yeah, look, it does depend where you are, but for now, investors are very heavily focused on housing, and I think it'll take a little bit more time for it to switch to that off the plan market.
Okay. Hey, what about the fringes of the capital city? So Brisbane, so you got Sunshine Coast, and then the Gold Coast. In Sydney, you got up to Central Coast, down to Wollongong, and you've mentioned Geelong before in terms of on the wings of Melbourne. What do you talked about in your blog that the Sydney boom is extending to those areas. So is that just a sheer which weight do you give more to affordability? So therefore, viable next best alternatives, or the fact that they can get this awesome lifestyle and affordability is a bonus?
Yeah, look, I think it's both. I think I think pricing now is the affordability issue. I think not even affordability. It's probably just the fact that people are more cashed up and interest rates are low and finding it easier to get money. So I think that's a factor. In Sydney, it does seem to be spreading up to Central Coast and down to Illawarra, but I think primarily because those two areas are almost part of Sydney now and are almost acting like outer suburban areas as opposed to regional cities. Illawarra in particular, I was there last week and in Wollongong, and it's actually seeing some of the highest views per listing for a regional area that we're seeing at the moment. So it has seemed to have switched. We were seeing very, very high demand in Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo, the outlying areas from Melbourne, and they're still doing pretty well. But now in Sydney, it really seems to be spreading to Central Coast and Illawarra that are doing particularly well.
All right, well there you go, folks. There's maybe an opportunity for you. Hey, we always like to keep an eye on Perth. I ask you every time. My hometown. It's like, come on, Perth. But your headline was the Perth, recovery continues. We talked previously about it being in the higher end. Are you seeing the more affordability parts of the market starting to move as well?
Not really. I mean, it's a funny market, Perth. It's they build a lot. Like, it's actually we did some analysis looking at housing built per 1,000 people over the past 35 years, and of all cities, Perth has built the most. So they're very good at building. They build a lot of house and land on the fringe. A very good brick industry there. They do a lot
brick.
of really solid brick.
Yeah.
So some really good quality homes, very solid homes that they're building on the fringe. But they build such a lot of them. So on one hand, we do talk about a Perth recovery, but it's a Perth recovery in the premium markets. If you go to Cottesloe or you go to Subiaco or Shenton Park, they're the areas that seem to be doing really, really well. But move beyond that, you start to see a big drop-off in performance, and so much so that in a Perth, we see about 5 times more views per listing in inner Perth than what we see even in middle or outer Perth. So it's quite extreme. I suppose that, house prices are one thing, and we're also seeing very good rental demand in Perth. Again, it's very premium market focused, so that's probably consistent with the fact that jobs that have been created in Perth are probably highly paid, and people are earning quite a bit of money. And then the other bit is around commercial property, so the office vacancy rate's coming down. So there's a lot of good signs in Perth, but it's not. I think people in Perth are really looking for that mining boom type change, but it's not going to be that sort of change. It's a gradual recovery that's flowing through to the market.
Yeah, I so desperately want it to be, just to have some good news for Perth. But it feels to me it's just gone from under, to more of a balance. So it's, we've cast an eye on it. You're right. For the price point that you would pay in those premium suburbs, you're kind of thinking, oh, do I want to be there, or do I want to be a bit closer to the population dense centres over on the East Coast? So it just kind of becomes this, I can see it's recovering, yeah, but the price point, yeah. And then when you go to the affordability point where you think, okay, that might be an opportunity, then you go, wow, I'm 45 kilometres to the north, and 45 kilometres is a fair bit for Perth. So just keep fluctuating between, because I see all the sentiment, I see all of my peers, I see everyone sort of going there, and even one of our guys here got interviewed on with Koshi on Sunrise, and he goes, well, a lot of my Perth friends are saying that it's starting to go, and the response was, yeah, but just bringing it back to balance, not necessarily bringing it where demand's exceeding supply.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty spot on.
Hey, I hinted at the top about the Red Rooster line. This was an amazing little insight that you had in your blog. Can you share everyone what the Red Rooster line strikes again means?
Yeah, so this is something that came out of Reddit quite some time ago, where I wish I knew the original author, but it got picked up by Sydney Uni. They published it in their paper. Basically, it's a line in Sydney that there's a string of red roosters that run up a road extending from the city out northwest of Sydney. And it's a Red Rooster line, and it seems to be a line that cuts into a lot of things. So there's a Middle Eastern chicken shop, which I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, but they're all on the left of the Red Rooster line. On the right, you've got, I think it's Charcoal Charlie's, they're all on the right. You've got things like Harris Farm, which is a gourmet supermarket. They're on the right of the Red Rooster line. On the left, you don't see this chain of supermarkets. So it does seem to be this demographic line that runs through Sydney, and we do see quite significant differences between the left and right of the line. What was interesting, though, we had a look at house prices between those two areas, and above and below $1 million median, there was a very clear line, that line held that if you went to the left of the Red Rooster line, pretty much everywhere was under $1 million. If you went to the right, everything was well over $1 million. So it's it's interesting that it also applies to housing.
Yeah, well, I think success does leave a few clues, because some of these bigger companies, like you think about Grilled, who charges a little bit more than McDonald's for a burger, they do their demographics around disposable income and how much money and what people like to spend and what are their buying decisions like. So it kind of makes sense. But the fact that you found that exact science around the Red Rooster line, I thought was intriguing.
I know. Thank God for people on Reddit. They look at these things really, really closely. So it's it was a good one.
I'm jealous that they've got the time. Where would you find the time to do that analysis?
I think it's a lot of students, perhaps.
All right, we're going to flick over to have a look at some property. It feels a little dirty, so property porn, but let's have a quick look at what is being the most viewed listing, as Stiggy helps me navigate here. This is the most viewed listing in Australia right now in the last 7 days, as per your site. So, Stiggy, is this going live? Who's double checking? All right, she's saying yes. So it was in Narre Warren, which is to the south of Melbourne. But if you have a quick look, it's pretty well manicured. There's a fair bit of space. It's fair to say that that's a bit more space than your average quarter-acre block there, Nerida. But the fit-out's quite nice inside as well. So it kind of makes sense why everyone's on your site looking at that, right?
Yeah, it's a pretty nice property.
Yeah, with who doesn't want a bit of space? And that, I mean, you are to the southwest, but at least you're still in commuter distance, so you get all that space for, I think, let's see.
One, I think. So which isn't, I mean, it's not cheap, but it's, compared to what you'd probably get in inner Melbourne.
Yeah, have a look at that backyard. That's pretty cool. So they ask, where's the quote around that? It was I've got a few things up on my screen here, 2.1 to 2.3. So there you go, folks. If you're in the market for that, lots of people are actually looking at that as well, based on realestate.com. Now, Nerida, have a look at this one. This is the most viewed one going to auction, with a displayed reserve of 780,000 for a two-bedder in Carlton North. And just to set the scene here, it's a pretty good spot.
I love Carlton North. So nice.
Is there anything wrong with some of the numbers in the back of your site there? That's only at 780.
Yeah, I can see why it's getting a lot of attention at 780. But then if you have a look at it, it's
All right, kitchens. All right, needs a little bit of work.
Yeah.
But it's when you start to get to these photos when you start to get a little bit nervous, a little bit of cracking forming there. But this one here, I think this would make even the most discerning renovator very, very nervous, seeing the extent of the cracking here. But clearly someone who's got an appetite, who can navigate the heritage overlays that would exist on that property, might be able to find themselves an opportunity, and hence the reason why it is a very well viewed listing on realestate.com this week. So there you go, folks. Give us a thumbs up if that's your cup of tea, or put in the comments and let us know if you do have an appetite for that, which would be interesting. Hey, let's have a look at what the most dollars spent in the last 7 days, Nerida. $6.5 million. This wasn't new, was it? With this budget. This is in Maroubra, so we've got some units here. Nice site, reasonably modern, and that's what you can get for $6.5 million, Nerida, that close to the beach there in a beachside suburb of Sydney there.
Yeah, I mean, it's not bad, 16 units. There was some quite big changes to the tenancy legislation in New South Wales a couple of years ago, so we do occasionally see these entire blocks come onto market and achieve some pretty decent values.
Yeah, $6.5 million, not bad. 16 units is probably a good cash flow on that. And then this is the last one, the most viewed rental. And if you just have a look at location, it's pretty quick to see why, at the very least, people would be interested in this. But if you dive in a little bit, you see it's $350 for a 3-bed unit, which is pretty good value. Inside, she's presentable enough, but I think it's that proximity.
I guess. Yeah.
And you're in a larger complex, so older, a bit more tired, but it gives you access to this location, which is pretty good. So there you have it, folks. Realestate.com last 7 days. There is the most viewed listing, the most viewed auction listing, the most expensive property in the last 7 days, and of course the most viewed rental listing. So Nerida, as always, your insights are very, very much appreciated. The sense of calm that you give in terms of all of this at times conflicting information that you have to decipher and make some bold predictions. But thanks very much for coming onto the couch. I look forward to you coming on next month, maybe in person.
Yes.
Good luck for the month ahead. I'm sure your calendar is super busy.
Yeah, great. I will speak to you next month. All
right, thanks, Nerida. There you go, folks. If you want to check out the Property Couch each and every week, we come out on Thursday. So all you need to do is go to thepropertycouch.com.au.